Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I am your host, Andrew Langer. Joining me today for a very interesting conversation is David Bernhardt. He is the only man to have served as altogether the solicitor, deputy secretary, and then as the 53rd Secretary of the Interior. He is an advisory board member at Advancing American Freedom. He's the chairman of the America First Policy Institute's Center for American Freedom, and I'm going to hold up the book. He's also the author of You Report to Me, Accountability for the Failing Administrative State, a topic that is near and dear to my heart. Mr. Secretary, welcome to the show today. Let's start here. Solicitor, Deputy Secretary, then Interior Secretary. I mean, you grew up in Colorado. I want to talk to you about Colorado in a bit. But, did you ever think that you would eventually become the Secretary of the Interior?
Actually, not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. I had the great privilege to go to the Department of the Interior because I was working in private practice with a wonderful lady named Gail Norton.
I know
who
her.
was
Yes.
Appointed and confirmed to be secretary. And, she was packing up her office, and so she's packing up her coffee mug and her briefcase. And I'm her associate, and I'm one of her associates, and she's basically like, well, do you want to go to Interior? And that's probably about as much thought as she put into it. And I thought I'd go for a year, and went to work for her, and ultimately ended up staying at Interior for 8 because the issues were just so interesting, and from my perspective, from where I was from in Western Colorado, so impactful. The decisions made by federal land managers can have tremendous consequences on communities, individuals, and I found the work incredibly interesting, and so I stayed for the entire George W. Bush administration, and I never thought in a million years that I would return to Interior. And then President Trump won. I looked at his policy agenda that he'd laid out in the campaign. I began to work on his transition, and I really believed what he was going to do on the issues related to the Department of the Interior was quite transformational. And so I was asked to serve as Deputy Secretary. It was a great opportunity to help lead an agency and drive some change. And then when Secretary Zinke's tenure ended, President Trump asked me to stay and ultimately nominated me to be Secretary of the Interior. But no, I can tell you I would have never put my name on the list of possibilities at all.
Let's talk about those policy issues, because it's one of those things where if you had been a Trump skeptic moving into the 2016 election, I don't know where you were in all of this. I was a skeptic, and then Trump began to enunciate the right things regarding policy and appoint the right people. Talk about, were you, I know I would have been surprised to learn that a president who had, spent all of his time in New York and or Florida would have had any interest in Western land issues, but yet he was doing the right things. Talk about those policies and what drove you to decide to come back in.
Well, President Trump did a couple things during the campaign in 2016 that I found really interesting. He laid out a vision of energy dominance, and at the same time highlighted a serious interest in being a conservation steward, and highlighted the opportunities in recreation and hunting and fishing, and really prioritized both of those values, which I thought was great for a Republican to do.
Yeah, and it's
and then
his. I'm sorry, go ahead.
His decisions in the campaign, he gave a series of speeches about energy, And his decisions in the campaign assured that when we walked in for the transition, as I began to work on the transition, I realized it was going to be quite consequential.
So recently we had on Margaret Byfield from American Stewards for Liberty. I know you know who she is, longtime land use advocate. And we were talking about this issue of the amount of federal land ownership out west. I was talking to a colleague just before you came on about what the Department of the Interior does. You talked about the impacts of these land use policies in places like Colorado. Talk about the sheer amount of federal land ownership. I know we're now finally going to get an inventory of that land. Talk about the sheer amount of federal land ownership and just how that impacts state and local governance.
Well, to put this in perspective, the Department of the Interior by itself manages 1 out of every 5 acres of land in the United States. And obviously, that land, that 1 in 5 acres, is not distributed proportionally. And so in some states, there are some states along the East Coast and eastern seaboard states that have very little federal land. They have some parks and battlefields and other things, but generally, the farther west you go, the larger swaths and larger percentages of land within states is managed by the federal government. And that affects a number of things. It affects the decisions that are made on that land in terms of who's deciding. Ultimately, those decisions are ultimately the responsibility of Congress through the property clause of the Constitution. Congress decides, is this a park? Is it a fish and wildlife refuge? Or is it multiple use land or Forest Service land? But as a result of that, efforts to acquire more federal land, which is something Margaret is very passionate and interested in, efforts to acquire additional federal land mean that there's a consequence to counties, communities, the private sector, when that land moves potentially from private hands to federal hands. And that can influence future economic development decisions, future taxation choices.
Right.
And all of those things have a consequence that as if you're in the government and you're acquiring land, those are things that I've always thought need to be well thought out and be carefully considered. As a matter of fact, one of the first things, I had as a policy that for a piece of federal land, for an acquisition to be made of a private land, you needed the support of the county and the governor.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of consternation by those who would rather just see the federal government make a decision. And that was one of the first things the Biden administration and Interior got rid of, was this notion. But I did that because there are a lot of communities, particularly in the East, that desperately want more public land access, more public land opportunities, and they would be supportive of efforts to expand the federal land management regime. But there are also communities and counties that are, over 90% owned by the federal government, and that has a tremendous impact on their ability to influence their destiny if you're taking land off the table for them in the future.
One of my first experiences with this, you and I were talking about this. I worked with a lawyer named Roger Marzullo, and we were representing Nye County, Nevada, in a lawsuit that had been brought by the federal government. The size of Vermont and New Hampshire combined, 93% owned by the federal government. Yeah, it was.
Exactly.
It was. Let me ask you this, because it's funny. I still think we ought to go down this road. There is this 30 by 30 agenda to permanently lock up 30% of land in, federal, state, whatever, preservation owner situations. At one point, I was advocating for something called a no net loss of private lands pledge. The idea that, much in the same way that Donald Trump was doing, 2 regulations out for everyone in, every time you want to acquire an acre of land, you have to get rid of someone somewhere else. But this would, of course, be hamstrung by the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. What do you think about this idea of having a no net loss of private lands?
Well, I think that I've seen that idea at different times, and I think that and similar ideas have merit. From the standpoint of this, that to be candid, my own personal view is that that the local government's views should be very important, and
Absolutely.
So if Congress makes a decision to acquire, they want to spend money on acquiring land. My view is that there's plenty of places that would like to have land acquired. And to be very candid, where I live in Northern Virginia, there's a great benefit to having people have access to public land. I grew up in Western Colorado. It took me 2 minutes to be on public land, and for me, as a person who is not wealthy, as soon as I was there, I essentially owned that land. Like I could do anything, like I could be on it, I could hunt, I could fish, and it was accessible to me. And so if people in a particular jurisdiction really want it and Congress wants to fund it, I'm not opposed to the idea in total. What I am opposed to is that an outside entity
Right.
that is unaccountable is not considering what the views of the local community are and what they want their destiny to be.
Let's talk about the issues of access, because I think you raise an excellent point. I spent a lot of time growing up going to Yosemite. I was very fortunate in that regard. My parents were big national park denizens. Where I live now, there's access. Listen, I say this. I live near Williamsburg, Virginia. So, we have the Colonial Parkway. Interestingly enough, I want to talk about efforts to restrict access to places like Yosemite and elsewhere, but also at the same time. So recently, the National Park Service started demanding that people pay their access fees to the Colonial Parkway in Williamsburg. There's some great consternation about that. Not that you necessarily need to talk about it, but I wanted to get your thoughts on access and about these efforts to sort of make people pay when they hadn't had to pay before.
Well, there's a couple theories on that I think are really important.
Yeah.
For enhanced recreational opportunities, the concept of the user pays is one that I think has validity.
Sure.
The question becomes, when you're paying for something that's not an enhanced recreational opportunity, or that these are things that are just used to make it difficult to enjoy our public lands, and there are elements of these agencies that would prefer that people actually not visit these facilities. And
wow.
I'm
sorry, David, let me interrupt for a second. It's like the line from the movie Clerks, this job would be great if it wasn't for the customers.
That is such a incredible statement. And I'll tell you that during COVID, I was working very hard with our best scientists, public health officers, to find ways to ensure access to our public lands. We might be closing movie theaters and closing visitor centers, but trying to keep public lands generally accessible. And I had a park make a proposal that they would close the gates of the park, but issue video cameras to park employees, and that they would literally take videos of the park and make them publicly accessible.
Oh my God!
As a solution, and I was like, that's not a plan that's going to fly. But that is a reality, and these are our public lands, and they need to be accessible to everybody.
Listen, I want to drill down into the regulatory process and the administrative state process, because those are obviously very near and dear to my heart. But I'm going to hold up the book again. You've got the book, You Report to Me, Accountability for the Failing Administrative State. And this gets into what you're talking about here, which is you come back, obviously, first you come in, Gail Norton is the Interior Secretary, a lot of pushback internally, as I know. We don't have to go through all the stories. Donald Trump gets elected president. People are surprised at this. You come back as Deputy Interior Secretary and then later as Interior Secretary. A lot of pushback internally. Talk about that push-pull, the recalcitrance, the reluctance of people inside these systems. And while you're talking about it, touch on this idea of Donald Trump had to move the headquarters of Interior out west.
Well, absolutely. Well, first off, I think it's important to recognize that there are a ton, just literally many great public servants.
Yes.
And as a matter of fact, my wife is a member of the civil service, and I would be in big trouble if I didn't highlight that. But there's always been an element of resistance. When I first started with Gail Norton, one of my first matters that she was concerned about was a water rights case.
Yes.
Related to the National Park Service, and I went down and met with the National Park Service. I'm a young lawyer. I go in and I have an idea of what we need to do, and I have my understanding of the law, the facts, the Secretary's views, and I lay out what I think our next step should be. And one of the senior executives in the Park Service says to me, "Good luck with that kid."
Wow.
And I thought, well, that's not the way the organizational chart looks.
Yes.
And so I went up to my office and I sat there for a couple hours, thinking through, okay, what do I actually tell the secretary? Because she's a wonderful person, but she's probably not going to react well to me saying, hey, I'm the new guy and here's what they said. So I had to think that through and ultimately figured out a way to work through that issue. That was in 2001. When I came back in 2017, and the book, You Report to Me, has a whole series of vignettes about experiences of other appointees in the Trump administration with the bureaucracy. And the reason those vignettes are in there is because, to me, they were really, really different than even what I experienced in 01.
Right.
In 17, there appears to be multiple instances, and these are highlighted in the book, where the administration is promoting a policy, and there's not only simply good luck with that kid, there's actively pushback and direction in a different way. And my concern with that is very fundamental. There are about 2.2 million civil servants, and every time there's an election, there's a change in about 3,500 positions.
Right.
And if you have a scenario where a president is elected with a change vision and a change message, as Trump certainly was, if you have somebody elected like that and the administrative state simply ignores the direction of the leadership from a policy perspective, my concern is not really with what that means for that individual presidency, although I think it's negative. But my real concern is what it means to the people who believe that they voted for change and they don't see it. And I think that's a fundamental threat to our system of governance if that were to continue. And so the title of the book, You Report to Me, is really about a vignette that I had with the president on one hand, where he told me I reported to him, but it also stands for the principle that everybody in government, the elected officials and the career officials and the political appointees, ultimately report to the people, and the actions that they take need to be informed by the law, the facts, and the policy preferences of whomever's elected, whether the person I voted for won or lost. at the end of the day, elections must have consequences.
Right, and policy ultimately matters, and it's one of those things where, right, I mean, it's one of the, listen, not that you and I need to sit here and debate climate change and climate policy, but let's assume for a moment, right, let's assume for a moment that there really was this consensus, and that the climate was changing, and that mankind is a driving force behind it. Let's say we all, everybody in America could agree on that.
That there's consensus.
Yeah, right. But then what we do about it then becomes the issue of great debate, and it can be informed by, what various stakeholders want and engaging in cost-benefit analysis and comparative risk assessment. And so, in the end, it's not just as simple as you coming in front and saying, I believe in, the mantra of climate change, what have you. It's interesting because I don't know if this is a vignette in your book. I now have to read the book, but I knew somebody I went to college with who I'd been friends with in college was a career civil servant at the Department of the Interior in one of the divisions, and made a great public show of resigning in protest over some policy that she had absolutely nothing to do with, by the way. But nevertheless, that was the thing. So I get this. And just a little side note on Gail Norton. I had actually, when the whole Harriet Miers thing happened during the Bush administration, I stood up there and wrote about it and said Gail Norton should have been the nominee to the Supreme Court. If I'd had,
well, I actually would agree with that.
I think Gail would have been great. So let's drill down a little bit into the nitty gritty here, because we talk about this process and the public's involvement in this, which is of vital importance. Congress passes a law. The law goes down to the agencies for the agencies to interpret and enforce. And that process is done through the regulatory process. Agencies have a great deal of power in all of this. I know you've written about this, and there are two twin doctrines at work here. Everybody talks about the Chevron doctrine, the idea that the agencies are given weight in terms of how they interpret congressional law. There's also the Auer doctrine, which is how that the agencies are given weight and how they interpret their own regulations. Talk about the dangers therein and why Chevron is up for debate at the Supreme Court right now.
So I think there are three, fundamentally, there are three things, and these are really what I highlight in the book you report to me. Number one, Congress's ability to delegate authority through very vague and broadly crafted laws has, I think, enabled agencies to move in very significantly different directions maybe than Congress thought.
David, let me interrupt for a second and say Congress passes the Clean Water Act in 1972, says you can't pollute a navigable water of the United States, and all of a sudden a dry patch of desert sand in the high desert in Nevada is a navigable water of the United States. This is what you're talking about. That would be a great example. And the Chevron and our doctrines, once the courts moved away from a requirement that the agencies persuade the courts of a decision, those decisions to defer to executive agencies meant, in my opinion, that the executive agencies were then more and more emboldened to push farther and farther on issues. And then what agencies do to themselves is the senior management delegates authority down and down and down, and then has very little accountability in that. And so what you have happen is a very junior official can end up taking a very extraordinary position that the Department of Justice will defend. And what that has done is really push the envelope on the power of the executive branch. Right.
And in doing that, I think the one easy thing to do is for the policymakers and agencies to recognize what their job is. And in my case, when I was the Secretary of the Interior, the job was to supervise all functions of the department.
Yeah.
And supervision is an active word. It's not passive. It's not figurehead. It's not show up at a party, be the reception person. It's an active term, supervise. It also conveys an element of accountability. If something goes wrong in that department, you should own all of the responsibility.
Right.
And policymakers have often wanted to push decisions away. When I was the solicitor, there were some policymakers that loved nothing better than if I could come up with an answer to a problem that said they had no discretion. Like they
Yes.
wanted to be told they had no discretion, because then they could say, well, David, put me in this box. And we, as policymakers, we often say, well, that was made by, Joe Smith in Tupelo, Mississippi, and it's not really out of my hands. And those are convenient ways to not take accountability. But when they go on for decades, they also lead to an impression that the people that aren't in charge are in charge. And that's inappropriate.
So let's, before we move off of regulations for a little bit, something I was talking about this morning in a meeting were these, one of the things that Donald Trump did when he came in was he put in an executive order on regulatory transparency and accountability. And at an agency like Interior, where you have all of these offices that have enormous power, not just through the regulatory process, but through guidance documents and interpretations letters, this is important stuff. Joe Biden turns around, comes into office, and within the first week gets rid of that executive order. Talk about why this transparency and accountability is so vital, especially for the citizen you were just talking about.
Well, we at Interior, we really implemented those policies very aggressively to be transparent. And at the end of the day, and I highlight in this book, there are instances where employees won't follow the law. There's instances where they won't follow the regulations. And there's instances where maybe they'll hide what their policy actually is. And, the citizenry has a right to have the ability to know what's happening. They should have the ability to see for themselves what are the standards that are going to be used, because otherwise what we have is an arbitrary form of government.
Right.
And that ultimately, it's very easy to say, well, all you have to do is take me to court. But that's not really viable for many people. And at the end of the day, arbitrary government leads to a lack of trust in government. Right. And that is where I fear we're headed if we don't begin to address some of these issues.
No, absolutely. And listen, that's why, in the Administrative Procedure Act, they have the arbitrary and capricious standard. And, and you're right, we seem to be getting away from that, and that's how we lead down the road to despotism. Let's turn our attention to some happier thoughts. Not that it's like picking your favorite child, but did you have a particular favorite park that you visited, or one that's near and dear to your heart?
So every park has its own significance. The first park I went to as a child was Mesa Verde, which is a very tiny little park in the scheme of parks, but it was a magnificent place because it opened up my eyes to a history and to a people. My wife and I were married right outside of Rocky Mountain National Park, and every place has a great story. And there's wonderful public lands, BLM lands. There's wonderful fish and wildlife refuges. My message to my own children was just love the outdoors. Yeah. And for me, there's a spiritual element to being outside and being one with nature.
It's funny because I hadn't realized that, for instance, the Pinnacles outside of Monterey, California, sort of in the Central Valley there, that had been expanded into a national park, and I was very excited. I remember camping there as a teenager. Exactly. I went to Mesa Verde with my family. I was just looking at the slides of my dad hoofing my younger brother on his back in a toddler backpack up and down those ladders when you could still do that. Trying to get out there.
You can't do that anymore.
You can't do that anymore. Trying to get out there this summer. And let me ask you this. I'm going to ask you right on the air because we're talking about going to Colorado this summer. I've made a plea to my family. The one thing that I absolutely want to do is I want to go and find the headwaters of the Colorado River. I've figured out where that is, and I want to go. But where should we go? We're going to obviously spend a couple days in Denver, and but where? If you had to put together an itinerary, what would be the top things that we should see?
Well, I love where you're headed.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go up towards Walden and then over to Craig and then down south and head all the way to Durango, you've seen a heck of a lot of the state of Colorado, and it's all beautiful and it's all great. But I'm a Western Sloper, so anywhere on the West Slope is pretty fantastic, whether it's spectacular mountains or high mountain desert or the Four Corners. I mean, I love it all.
You know, we tell a story. It's family folklore. We were outside of Mesa Verde in Durango and went to a Mexican restaurant, and I ordered a taco, and I don't know what I was thinking, but it was a taco the size of an elephant's ear. And I literally looked at it, and I couldn't even, I didn't know how to attack it. I'm like 10 years old, and I couldn't figure out how to do this. But yeah, we gotta, this is the way it worked in my family. My parents were academics. I never told the story on the air, at least on these airways. And I was very fortunate. My dad could take 6 weeks off in the summer.
Oh, wow.
And we would drive out to California from New York, spend 2 weeks driving out, spend 2 weeks in California, and 2 weeks driving back. And my parents were not amusement park people. They were national park people. So, you know, we would just go and we would hit. So I had one of those.
That is
great. You've never seen it, folks. I had one of those passport books. I still have it.
Absolutely.
With the little stickers, you get the things, and you hit as many parks as possible. So let me promote the book once again. You Report to Me: Accountability for the Failing Administrative State. My guest has been David Bernhardt. David, former Secretary of the Interior, Secretary Bernhardt. How do folks find out more about the good work that you're doing, sir?
Well, basically, go to American First Policy Institute. There's great stuff there. And if you're interested in the book, go to www.youreporttome.com.
Youreporttome.com is the website. Well, thank you very much, good sir, for joining us today. This has been yet another episode of The Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. If you've been watching us on YouTube, please, you're welcome to listen to the podcast episodes as well, wherever fine podcasts are purveyed. If you are listening to us, come and check out the videos on YouTube. Have a great week, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.